In a letter to his wife Abigail on the 3rd of July in 1776, John Adams wrote, "The second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the Day of Deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore." Although America's Independence Day became the 4th of July, when the Declaration was officially adopted, Adams' prediction of an annual celebration was realized, and the day became our first patriotic holiday. 137 years later, in 1910, the country stood ready to celebrate another 4th of July. Americans were up early this Monday morning, decorating houses and stores with red, white, and blue, and preparing food for family picnics. Young boys were already setting off firecrackers and cap pistols to the dismay of neighborhood girls and animals. In the small southwestern Ohio city of Middletown, citizens had much to celebrate. Industry was booming and expanding. In March, the American Rolling Mill Company, Armco, broke ground east of town for a major steel mill. The company was only 10 years old, but the demand for new steel products was growing, and the mill on Curtis Street could not keep up with the market. Middletown was growing also. City leader Lilburn T. Palmer declared, "Every city has its favored line of projection, and the watchword in Middletown for extensions of business and homes is eastward." New housing developments in Park Place and the Highlands were planned, and the Nine Brothers had opened Oakwood Park and were finishing Maple Park. For young Gladys Bannon, the 4th of July was always exciting.
It was always a custom of my father, Owen Bannon, to entertain the children of the neighborhood. Our home was on the Phipps Estate, which now is Vale Middle School. And it was his custom to have a large 4th of July celebration for the children. He had a large fireworks display. And it was right after lunch on the 4th of July, and he was setting up the display at the end of our long lane.
But early that hot afternoon, the celebrations turned to chaos. Just west of Middletown, in nearby Madison Township, a tragic event occurred on the CH&D Railroad, one that remains the worst single-day man-made disaster in the history of the Miami Valley. The first decade of the 20th century had been one of great change for America. Mostly due to the flood of immigrants from Europe, the population had grown from 76 million to 92 million. In 1903, Henry Ford introduced the Model A automobile, and the Wright brothers from Dayton, Ohio, conquered the air with the first powered flight. Transportation was changing rapidly, but the railroad was still king. America had emerged as a world military power after the Spanish-American War ended in 1898. The Stars and Stripes now flew in faraway corners of the globe when the United States took control of the Philippine Islands in the Pacific Ocean. In 1900, U.S. forces helped defeat the Boxer rebels in China, and in 1909, President Taft sent troops to Nicaragua to protect U.S. business interests. That same year, the Great White Fleet of 16 U.S. battleships returned home after a 15-month-long world tour to promote goodwill and show its might to would-be enemies. Uncle Sam was flexing his muscle. On the 4th of July in 1910, America was poised for a different fight, a prize fight, the heavyweight championship of the world. Excitement had reached a fever pitch in the sports world as fans awaited the fight of the century between reigning champion Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries, the undefeated retired champ. But this fight was more about social issues than boxing superiority. The flamboyant, outspoken Johnson had become the first black fighter to win the heavyweight crown when he easily defeated Australian Tommy Burns in 1908. Most white Americans were shocked by this event, and by 1910, the press, led by writer Jack London, had coaxed Jeffries out of retirement, calling him the Great White Hope. In Reno, Nevada, a crowd of more than 12,000 mostly white men watched as the younger, more nimble Johnson defeated the overweight Jeffries under a sweltering July 4th sun. When Jeffries was knocked down in the 15th round, his corner called it quits to prevent a knockout. In the prejudicial climate of 1910 America, the aftermath was violent. Many whites were humiliated by Jeffries' defeat, while blacks were jubilant, celebrating Johnson's victory as one for racial advancement. In some cities, the celebrations led to fights, leading the press to erroneously report the outbreak of widespread rioting. Nonetheless, by the end of the week, 23 blacks and 2 whites had been killed. As the day began for passengers aboard the New York to Cincinnati Flyer number 21, events began to unfold that would result in a catastrophic end for some. The Flyer had pulled out of Grand Central Terminal in New York City at 6:30 p.m. the night before, as part of the 20th Century Flyer bound for Chicago, Illinois. It reached Cleveland, Ohio at 7:50 a.m., where it separated and headed south on the Big 4 line to Cincinnati. With one stop in Columbus, the Flyer reached Dayton sometime before 11 a.m. Due to an accident on the Big 4 line earlier that morning at Gano, just north of Cincinnati, the Flyer was detoured to the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton line, the CH&D. Under orders from the train dispatcher, J.W. Wall from Cincinnati was placed in charge of the train while it was on the CH&D line. When I asked for orders, I was given 4 orders, including order number 48, which said, Dayton, Ohio, July 4, number 1, engine 201 will display signals Dayton to Cincinnati for engine 6448. First number 1 will run 20 minutes late, Dayton to Hamilton. Second number 1, the Big 4 Limited, will run 1 hour late, Dayton to Cincinnati. Time 11 a.m. This meant that the Flyer, also called the Big 4 Limited, had a clear track from Dayton to Cincinnati, running exactly 1 hour later than the regular CH&D train number 1. Sometime before noon, the Limited left Union Station. "20 miles to the south at the CH&D depot in West Middletown, Agent Joe Kreider received an order to allow a CH&D freight train out of Cincinnati to pass and sidetrack 4 miles north of Middletown at the Post Town station. The northbound freight crew received order number 60 in Middletown, but at 12:50 they did not have time to make it to Post Town before 1:07 p.m. So they decided to go onto the siding just 200 yards north of the Middletown-Eaton road crossing. The stage was now set for confusion and disaster. The Big 4 Limited is speeding south at 60 miles an hour, and a northbound freight has just pulled up on the same track past the switch and is set to back onto the siding. The time is 1:01 p.m.
I heard the whistle of the freight train and heard the other train whistle too. I got up and turned to wave my handkerchief at them. I'd hardly been on my feet a second when they both shrieked out a whistle I shall never forget as long as I live. It was terrible. And then there was a crash. We all turned around to see what had happened, but the steam and the smoke didn't clear away for so long that it was almost impossible to make out just what did occur. Emily Woodhull, West Middletown.
What had occurred defied description. The flyer was traveling close to 60 miles an hour when it rounded a bend and came face to face with a stationary freight. Like two giant mountain rams, the heavy steam locomotives butted heads, neither giving much due to their massive iron and steel construction. Side rods and cylinders were ripped from their mounts and the wooden cabs, now empty, collapsed. The sheer force of the impact was transmitted through the black machines to the lighter stopped freight train, initiating a rear movement of the entire mass. The CH&D freight locomotive's tender and a loaded gondola were both shoved completely upon the trailing gondola, absorbing some of the overall force of the collision. The heavy passenger cars following the Big 4 Brooks locomotive number 6448 suffered a much different fate. A split second following contact, the forward momentum pitched the tender and a combination baggage smoker car together straight up into the air in a giant vertical scissors motion, both locked together momentarily before collapsing on the east side of the railway and falling completely across a line of freight cars parked on the siding. But the worst was yet to come. With the tender and baggage car totally clear of the main tracks, the loaded day coach number 717 rammed full force into the rear of 6448, telescoping and shattering its wood frame into thousands of fatal splinters before rupturing the steel locomotive's powerful boiler. The helpless passengers, not shredded by oak shards, were scalded to death. A second day coach remained intact but was derailed and tossed against the sided freight cars. A massive cloud of dirt and coal dust, steam and smoke enveloped the entire scene, swallowing the survivors in total blackness. A group of picnickers on the hill above the tracks were among the first on the scene. As they made their way through the muddy cornfield next to the tracks, they began to hear screams and low moans of the injured and dying.
It seemed an awfully long time before people who were in the cars began to move about, and I thought they would never come out.
As the steam and smoke cleared, the site quickly filled with people from nearby houses, those waiting at the depot just down the tracks, and the passengers from the back coaches who were unhurt.
There were so many that needed help, it was hard to know which needed it the most. There was a man that helped me pull a woman from underneath the wreck, and when we got her out, she was still alive. I helped a man take off his coat, and his arm was nearly cut off, but he wanted to help the others, hurt more badly than he.
Now the call for medical help widened. Every doctor in nearby Middletown was summoned. Lieutenant Colonel William M. Sullivan of the 1st Ohio Infantry heard the news through the call for doctors and grabbed 2-quart bottles of whiskey to administer to the injured. When the CH&D and the Big 4 railroad officials at Dayton and Hamilton were notified by wire, they contacted doctors from both cities who rushed to the scene. Soon the bridge across the Great Miami River from Middletown was filled with automobiles, ambulances, hearse wagons, and scores of onlookers. Local police hurried to the bridge to keep the path clear for the wagons transporting the injured and dead. Most of the victims were riding in the first two cars, the combination car in which there were 6 passengers and the day coach carrying 21. Rescuers began the awful task of removing the victims pinned underneath the debris. Body after body was taken out and laid in the clearing between the tracks and the cornfield. Within an hour, over 3,000 people were on the scene. Vehicles of all sorts lined the roads for over a mile. The personal effects of the passengers were strewn along the track: suitcases, clothing, wallets, and jewelry. The local police were careful to take charge of all property and turn it over to the coroner's office. The injured who could walk made their way to telephones and telegraph offices to inform their families of their safety. Those more seriously injured were transported to hotels and private homes, as there was no hospital in Middletown in 1910. At the local funeral homes, undertakers scrambled to find clues for identifying the dead and informing the county coroner. At 2:30 p.m., a CH&D relief train arrived to transport more injured to Dayton and Hamilton. When the wrecking train arrived, the cars which were able to be moved were pulled away from the wreckage, and the search continued for more bodies. Hundreds of people watched the work proceed until late in the afternoon, and as darkness fell, they made their way back home. All night long, the work continued, and a heavy fog made it almost impossible to see for any distance. Lanterns could be seen going back and forth along the debris, and shouts of the foreman could be heard throughout the night until morning broke. In the little depot came the news, flashed over the wire, that the track is clear. With the wreckage cleared, the CH&D track was repaired quickly and the line was back in operation. But life would never be the same for thousands in the Miami Valley. Initially, the number of deaths was reported at 21, with 35 injured, but the Butler County coroner, J.A. Burnett, was still identifying bodies. Now the stories of the victims were being told, and the random nature of death was realized. The first body to be pulled from the wreckage was that of Sing Yen Lun, a native of China living in Columbus, Ohio. An aspiring young actress on her way to Cincinnati was taken still alive to a nearby residence. She was just able to give her name, Faye Daubenmire, before she expired. Her traveling companion, a little Spitz dog, survived. A Dayton couple on a postponed honeymoon were separated by death when Reverend J. Smith Kirk was killed instantly and his wife Mary survived. His Sunday school at Riverside M.E. Church spent the day at an annual picnic, only to learn that evening that their beloved pastor would never return. George Bodie and his wife Jessie were sharing the same seat in the first coach. He was on the aisle and she was next to the window. He remarked to his wife that the train seemed to be traveling at a great speed when the blinding crash ripped her from her seat and tossed him into darkness. I don't know how I got out, but I clambered upright in some manner and my groping hand found a shattered window. I pulled myself up and climbed through the window to safety. Bodie fought rescuers to get back into the wreckage to find his wife, but he was persuaded to go to the U.S. Hotel in Middletown, still believing she might have survived. Only when he returned to Dayton on the relief train did he learn of her death. Another Dayton businessman, Hackman A. Smith, missed an earlier train, only to end his life on the ill-fated flyer. Perhaps the saddest stories were those of the children. 5 teenage boys from Dayton were riding between the tender and baggage car of the flyer on their way to Cincinnati to celebrate the 4th. Train jumping was a common practice for young daredevils in those days, but this ride would prove fatal. Unbelievably, none of the boys died instantly, but after being taken to a nearby house, they were given the last rites by a local priest. By morning, all 5 were gone. 7-year-old Samuel Wayne Garrigus became an orphan in a split second when his parents died instantly in the crash. When the boy was found with his right arm almost severed, his concern was for the whereabouts of his parents and not himself. Only days later was he told by relatives that his parents had died. Survivors of the terrible crash would never forget the events of the day or understand how or why they survived when so many others perished.
There was a terrible crash and then a second one even more violent than the first. I picked myself up and started to get out of the car when I looked up and saw that the roof of the car was split wide open. I managed to climb out on the roof and dropped from there to the roof of a freight car. The escaping steam was burning me as I left the car. I believe I was the last one to get out alive. J.E. Brown, Newark, New Jersey.
It was 6:10 p.m. before the CH&D relief train pulled into Union Station in Dayton. A large crowd waited impatiently for word of the victims, and ambulances were drawn up to the baggage room, ready to speed the injured to hospitals. At about the same time, the Big 4 relief train, with injured that had been transported 2 miles into the Middletown depot, pulled in at the south track, which set the crowd into a wild rush for the train. As police struggled to clear a path, the injured were helped off the train. A shudder went through the crowd as they witnessed the terrible reality of the day's events. Almost immediately after the awful crash, accounts of what happened were being debated. The CH&D line was blaming the Big 4 line and vice versa. The crew of the freight train number 90 was convinced that the passenger train ran ahead of its schedule and that the freight had a free track after it passed West Middletown. The crew of the Big 4 flyer claimed they had an order from Dayton that showed they had the right of way. Miraculously, most of the crew members of both trains managed to jump to safety with just seconds to spare. Reporters seeking accurate information to relay to their papers faced several obstacles. The exact location of the wreck was not known. Rumors had spread that hundreds had been killed at Post Town, but after reaching the site and gathering what information they could, the reporters made their way to the morgues in Middletown, where they obtained the identification of the victims and released it hours before the coroner's official report. Early newspaper reports laid blame for the accident on Albert B. Smith, the CH&D dispatcher in Dayton, for letting the flyer proceed south as far as West Middletown and directing the CH&D freight to proceed north to Post Town. As reported, when he realized his mistake, he gave operator Joe Kreider at West Middletown a verbal order to have the freight run in on the side track. When Kreider received the bust order, he rushed out with the order in his hand, but it was too late. When the news was relayed by telephone to Dayton that the trains had crashed, dispatcher Smith resigned immediately and left the city, overcome by grief. On Monday, July 11th at 9:15 a.m., the Butler County Coroner's inquest into the July 4th train wreck began at the Hamilton, Ohio courthouse. 30 witnesses had been subpoenaed to testify, mostly trainmen and dispatchers from Dayton, Cincinnati, Springfield, and Middletown. Most critical was the testimony given by Dayton dispatcher Albert Smith, who again refused to accept total blame for causing the accident, stating that he had intended to give an order to the passenger train at Carlisle, but it was going much too fast. At the end of all the testimony that day, Coroner Burnett stated that the testimony shows that the blame lies in the dispatcher's office in Dayton, in my opinion. In the newspapers on Wednesday, E.A. Gould, General Superintendent of the CH&D Railroad, announced that after a separate company investigation into the matter, Dayton dispatcher Albert Smith had been discharged from the company. The State Railroad Commission ended their hearings on Thursday, July 14th, and announced their conclusions with three main facts. Number one, the passenger train was traveling at a high speed, attempting to make up time. It was going 80 miles per hour in some places and 55 miles per hour when the crash occurred. Number two, the Big Four flyer was in the hands of a conductor who had no experience with passenger trains. Conductor Wall had testified that he didn't really know how fast the train was traveling. Number three, Dayton dispatcher Smith erred greatly. Smith testified that he did not feel he was solely at fault, saying, "With the speed that train was going, it was bound to hit something somewhere." The investigations were over and the blame was placed, but still 36 innocent passengers on the fateful flyer were dead and 50 were scarred with the injuries of that day. It seemed that nothing good would result from the errors of a few. In November the year before, the American Rolling Mill Company president George M. Verity had announced at a meeting of city leaders that the company planned to expand its steelmaking operation in Middletown by building a huge plant on the east side of town. That would mean that the population of the town would be increasing and community improvements were badly needed. Verity concluded his remarks with a challenge. "Men of Middletown, what do you say? What will you do?" Out of the meeting came the program for Greater Middletown, which included plans for a new library, a YMCA program, park improvements, expanded school services, and a hospital. It was widely agreed that had there been a hospital in Middletown when the July 4th train wreck occurred, some of the injured who died while en route to hospitals in Dayton and Hamilton would probably have survived. Plans for a hospital were slow in getting started, but then in March of 1913, the area was hit with another disaster, the Great Flood. Over 1,000 families sought refuge when the Great Miami River overflowed its banks. Although Middletown did not suffer any casualties, there were several citizens injured. The need for a hospital now became a major priority for the city. Later that year, the Middletown Hospital Association was incorporated and a campaign to raise funds began. Construction was slowed by World War I, but the hospital was finally completed in 1915, only to have the opening delayed due to a lack of funds. But on March 5, 1917, almost a full 7 years after the great train wreck of 1910, the hospital was opened and the first patient was admitted. History records its daily events and rolls on, generation after generation. The first-hand stories of that tragic Independence Day a century ago are no longer told, the accounts of the event all but forgotten. But anniversaries serve to remind us that the legacy of a single instant in time endures, and we remember.